Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bassam Haddad. I am the founding director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program and associate professor at the Shar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. This event is titled Women and the Law in Syria, Intersectional Reading of Rights and Politics of Law. And it will be delivered by Dina Hadad, who is not related. Her last name is with one D, spelled with one D. Unfortunately, as you might have heard, we actually have had an issue with the broadcast, and only uh, uh, a quick solution, which is what we're doing today, allows us to bring to you Dina Haddad. The location where Dina is right now does not allow for live broadcast from the particular program we're using. So we are going to record this event with Dina, and we are a bit frazzled. So bear with us, but we are going to persevere and we're going to deliver this event. And thank you, Dina, for persevering with us.
Thanks a lot, Bassam.
And welcome to George Mason. And I should say that this event is also co-sponsored by the Middle East and Islamic Studies program, the Shar School, as well as the Arab Studies Institute. I will say a few words about Dina, and then we'll give Dina the floor. The title again is Women and the Law in Syria, Intersectional Reading of Rights and Politics of Law. Dina Hadad is a specialist in international law with first-hand knowledge of socio-legal and political complexities of the Arab world. Her legal experience is complemented by her doctoral research from the University of, I'm going to have a problem pronouncing this, Dina, Aberystwyth in the UK, in international law and human rights, followed by several academic posts in the United Kingdom and the Middle East. She has teaching and research experience in a range of legal and political areas, including international law, human rights, security and development, international environmental law, Islamic politics, and legal perspectives on intersectionality and feminism. Dina has many other things under her belt, but we will not have time to share them because I'm sure everyone wants to hear Dina address the topic today. Dina, again, I am very sorry that where you're located will not allow you to broadcast live. So we're doing this not on the air, on Zoom, and we will be broadcasting it live ourselves a bit later, despite the restrictions. Dina, we will have about, take as long as you like. Unfortunately, there will be no Q&A, but I will actually make available, if it's okay with you, an opportunity for everyone to send in questions and with their emails, and I can ask you to respond if you have time in the future. With all of this, Dina, let me just ask you one question before you start. How are you doing? How is your family doing, given the recent calamity in Syria and, of course, in Turkey?
Thanks a lot for the question. I am okay, but I mean, completely distressed by the fact that this is really such a tragedy taking place, and it's a continuous disaster. I mean, I don't know, it might be a natural one at the moment. However, it does really add to a lot of misery and suffering in the country. It's such an unfortunate, such a sad reality. I'm very, very saddened, and I mean, I have some relatives and some family. Thanks God, they are not directly affected, but I mean, they are living through the uncertainty of the moment. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us despite all, and I hope your friends and family are safe. Unfortunately, so many people perished, and I have no words. We had an event about this last week. I don't even know how long it was, actually, maybe even before. And there were actually no words. But we did address the earthquake and its implications and aftermath and ramifications and the unfortunate developments afterwards in terms of the inadequate level of attention given to the victims locally, regionally, and internationally. At this point, I will open the floor to you and ask you to feel free to present. And I know that you have a PowerPoint that you would like to share.
Yeah, I'm going to just share the PowerPoint. I hope this is showing. Yeah.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk about, as the title of this talk, I mean, explicitly refers to women and the law in Syria. And I mean, since we have mentioned already the earthquake, I'm just going to say a couple of extra words on this, because I mean, suddenly everything doesn't really bring the same relevance when there is such a great tragedy. And while I was really looking into my material, I mean, it's not only that reality of women and human rights is completely altered and fluctuated throughout the last few years. It's also the fact that you can never hold a moment and stand on this reality throughout, I don't know, our current point of stand. However, I'm going to try my best. I will reflect a little bit on a more holistic sort of issues, but my plan would be really addressing the concept that is talking about the agency of women. And I will explain what do I mean by that. And this is really referring to a concept of expertise, the expertise of women in the context of legal practice. I will provide some sort of information just to explain my methodology, which is really based on qualitative sort of methodology. And then we'll talk about some limitations that would apply to any similar sort of socio-legal and socio-political research. I would have two main points to reflect upon. They are socio-legal and political realities, within which I will talk about the rule of law and the issue of minority women being considered or regarded as minority within minorities. And then we'll talk about the politics of law. And under that, I'm going to discuss a couple of cases from my own interviews. Then we'll contextualize a bit more about the issue of security in the light of the current reality and provide some concluding remarks. We'll start directly, and I think every time we talk about women's rights, the main sort of concept that hovers over all of these discussion is empowerment, women empowerment. And no matter how much we are critical towards empowerment, especially brought by international projects and international organizations or national and regional organizations, I've got really to admit that I do not really shy away from the concept of empowerment. And I am particularly in favor of empowerment and liberation of women in the general sense, without much restrictions. Nonetheless, having said that, I still hold some sort of critical points with regard to empowerment as a concept perpetuated throughout actually a women's rights journey in the region and further. And within that context, we always refer to the issue of economic activity and economic producing, I mean by that producing income for women, and how is this really never materialized in a sufficient or adequate sort of empowerment for women. And then also the fact that gender responsive structures and the binary approach did really have some sort of problems, especially the risk of reproducing the same sort of challenges, since it does really focuses on the roles of men and women, and it does not really open space for women to have equal sort of stands. In addition to that, I think one of the main motives or the main sort of grounds that push me beyond the issue of empowerment is the fact that we are living within an ongoing sort of crisis. I mean, a crisis does really characterize the area in general. I don't wanna really expand on the issue of exceptionalism and crisis in general sense. However, reality in Syria in the last at least a decade or more does really reflect a conflict, economic hardship, immigration, displacement. And all of this did really change somehow in some occasions positively the roles of household and positions and opened new opportunities for women. Nonetheless, the reflections on that does not really promise a lot of sustainability. And for that reason, I was really in search for specific sort of concept that would help me more utilize some sort of expertise within or empowerment from within. For that, I adopted the methodology of a qualitative approach, and that really meant collecting some sort of ethnographic records from female legal practitioners and activists. Of course, the research is ongoing, and it does really plan to include male and men opinions within that context. And what do I mean by agency and expertise? It's actually identified within Holden literature as the special knowledge that locates relevance and help the formation and transcending of rights and obligation from one side, the cultural, to the legal sphere, and on the other side, and that's on the other side, and national to international also. Seeking this cultural sort of expertise in such legal practice, particularly within the region, and development requires reading and change and transformation in the area within the immediate sort of context. And thus is really my methodology based on that. In order to be able to talk about Syrian reality, I think it's very essential to highlight some sort of limitations, though. I mean, in the light of all taking place, it's very difficult actually. I mean, the case of Syria is not typical anymore. It's not something that you could really address within the same sort of tools you address when you are dealing with women's rights and so on. So what's Syrian? Who's Syrian? That's really now a different sort of question, or a question that needs to be approached a bit different, since we are really talking about Syrian women. What does really identify Syrian women in the social context, cultural, political, geographical, in the current point, considering the fact that Syria is not particularly under one sort of governmental or governance sort of limits. And then also, what sort of crisis we are really addressing. I mean, usually we are looking at the issue of human rights and how do we deal with women's rights and so on. However, we have a combination of crises at the moment. We have multi-layered, multifaceted sort of crisis. It's not anymore the issue of discussing women's rights and human rights in natural context. And that would mean taking into consideration a holistic approach while keeping the focus on our specific sort of study. While talking about women agency and women as a mediator and an expertise that could really translate and communicate their own needs within the society, I do really recognize, or the study recognizes the fact that that women do really have a double sort of role. There are a lot of women that could really carry on a patriarchal sort of narrative and re-emphasize the limits that brought by such system. We have to take into account that what we're going to really deal with also are selected sort of examples, and they are examples coming out of the discussion with the people that I interviewed in that context. Also, the intersectional aspect is very essential. While we discuss issues related to women, the study does really bear in mind the fact that this binary beneficial system is not always going to produce a reform unless it's really cohesive and does really consider issues across the line of gender and social status and other sort of elements. Now I'm going to start with the socio-legal and political dynamics that are really under consideration in my study. And for that, I'm really dealing with the context of the law and the government in place, if we may say so, or the agency that is really producing the legal sort of structure still at the moment within the Syrian territory. And it's pretty much similar to a number of other narratives around the region, and that's really with regard to the unrealization of the rule of law and the fact that this is a long-standing issue that affords substantial sort of value to the role and impact of women expertise, the role of women. So it does really affect women and their role in legal reforms pretty much as it affects any other sort of rights and aspects within available legal frameworks. While looking at the reality of women, I think one of the main things that comes really across clearly in this discussion is how do we understand this reality? How do we understand the social reality in a declared secular state by constitution? I mean, the fact that the state is really lives within a social and political multiplicity since its inception is something that does really contribute to the way we look at the national social agenda and the government. And while it's from the outset supporting a secular sort of framework, this did not really materialize and fell short of the set standards within the constitution and so on. Women are pretty much like any other sort of segment of the society, are struggling to be able to communicate to these standards and to stand with the government at the level that they could really negotiate their own rights. And it's even more problematic with women because we are dealing with a segment that is considered even minority within other minorities. So the dynamics that applies actually when we are discussing minorities and their ability to connect with regard to legal frameworks and reproducing all sorts of rights as it's really communicating to cultural and economic realities, it does really multiply when we are dealing with women. And thus, women needed also, or they need to develop their own mechanisms in a way that does respond to the fact that they are not really represented nor considered in the same way at the macro and the micro level. So within their own tribe, within their own sects, within their own families, there is still actually this adopted sort of dynamic that needs always to be reproduced in order to establish connection, rather than having the natural sort of mediating connection with a normative and formal legal producing system. How Syrian women regard their role as mediators for their own rights through history is a very essential question that was discussed when I really conducted my interviews. And this is really important in order to be able to understand whether they do really see themselves as mediators of their own rights. And of course, the sample that is really chosen is within the context of legal professionals and activists. And this would really mean that they are women that are aware of their own legal rights and frameworks, and they are quite prepared to reflect on that. And through that, I mean, in my example, I would reflect on some elements related to the fact that they are regarding specific events in history as very relevant, including some in the contemporary sort of process of lawmaking. I'm going to reflect on normative developments before and after 2011, and this is also to identify how these observations or how these sort of discussions within the interviews led to another example with regard to the honor killing. And that's indicative, I think, in terms of understanding to what extent women could be absent, actually. They could be active, they could be in a positive sort of space where they could really negotiate their own role, and they could also be absent despite the fact that normative sort of development is taking place. I think another element that needs also to be reflected upon is the issue of immigration and economy, and how does this really affect women in general, the Syrian concept as social and political and economic, and how each of the corruption and the sanction do really affect the reality and securities in general. When we talk about the politics of the law, I think the frames that we are referring to are the constitutional guarantees and international commitments. Both the former constitution and the current constitution of 1973 and the constitution of 2012, both of them do really refer or do really provide to some sort of endorsement and support of women's rights, and providing women with enough opportunities to be able to take their role and participation politically and at so many other levels. I mean, I think it's under Article 45 in 1973 Constitution and Article 24 under the 2012. Nonetheless, this never really provided some sort of active legislation that does really call for no discrimination against women. And the lack of such a legal stand is really problematic since the Constitution remains somehow blind with regard to what is really needed to be taken in order to make sure that this equality is taking place. And I think, and I also, I find quite interesting the way the place of this article with regard to women changed between Constitution of 1973 and Constitution of 2012. So while it was under rights and freedoms in 1973, it became actually under what's called social principles in the 2012. And the fact that it is really flexible and could be really moving between these sections, I think is quite interesting in terms of understanding or value sort of purpose for such an article. I mean, what do we mean that this is really part of social principles? Is that really in general sense? Does that really lead to social justice? There are a lot of questions that need to be put in place in order to be able to understand to what extent this social framework is really providing constitutional guarantee. In terms of international commitments, I think that it's important to highlight the fact that Syria joined and ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Violence against Women in 2003, but not its optional protocol for the obvious reasons of implementation issues. And it has its own reservations to the convention with regard to issues related to mother rights to pass its own nationality under Article 9.2, and regarding freedom of movement, issues with regard to equal rights and responsibility during marriage, and so on. I mean, all of this did not actually translate in different sort of understanding of rights and so on. Reality of women remained problematic before the war in 2011 and after the war. I mean, ratification did not bring about any sort of implementation either. Aspirations, however, of activists were always at a complete different level. They were always, especially, I mean, records of the interviews do provide to the fact that before 2011, their benchmark was really higher, and they always really found themselves focused in the sense that they are really looking for specific sort of changes and reforms. This at some point, and naturally due to the war and the reality that does not really need to recognize particularly women and their own rights, but the human rights in general and all other violations that took place and keep taking place. However, legal access has been always an issue. That was really something that troubled women throughout, whether it's really at the court judicial level or at the ability to affect normative and legal lawmaking processes. Avoids also through the legal rights and implementations do really exist in a number of laws, including personal status laws, labor law, inheritance, a number of other issues related also, for example, to gender-based violence and so on, are really considered by conciliation courts, and they are most of the times getting to the point of really dropping without a sentence and so on. That's a reality that women lived through before 2011. However, they did really manage to make some sort of advancement, if we may so. Some groups campaigned and lobbied for some changes, especially with regard to custody rights and a number of other rights. After 2011, there was obviously a drastic decline in rights on grounds of developments, child marriages, and right to education, right to health, mental health, sexual reproductive health. And also, not very recently, in the last few years, the issue of food security. I think this is a very essential issue because it does really bring about discussions with regard to freedom, development, and security. And I think this is really, really relevant and essential because once it does really take place again, it's very difficult to discuss and maneuver through the margins of or against the narrative that women's rights are just a luxury in such a context. The first example that I'm going to really address, which does really provide for a positive, or at least regarded as a positive sort of stand in the context of normative development in women rights and so on, was the rejected draft of personal status law in 2009. There was at the time a published draft of the law that seems to have dealt with, that seems to have disregarded the aspirations of the woman and provided some languages that's challenging and changing historical and cultural context. And most of the legal practitioners that I really interviewed argued that women should really have the right to their own normative development in a way that relates to their own reality. And thus, they recall this sort of process in a way that they think it made some sort of positive change, since they managed to make enough pressure to reject the language. Their main fear was the fact that the courts would stick to formalist sort of interpretation of the law, and the language used would never really be only another way of expressing the same language as it's been argued at the time. And of course, there are a lot to read in between. I mean, the draft was really published or provided to the public in a very unprecedented manners. I mean, it didn't happen before that such a draft was really available. But yet, this really provided space for women activists to pursue their own agenda, in a sense that they felt it materialized in rejecting such a change of the law. And that's, for them, at least for the sample that I dealt with, seemed to be remarkable, seemed to be very essential. They felt that they are really mediating, they are really communicating and providing their own expertise as women living within a specific sort of society, and this produced what they were really looking for somehow. I mean, it's very difficult actually to stand on the political reality of the whole process, of the fact that this really provided to public, being discussed in a specific sort of context, and whether it was really meant to be rejected in the first place, and whether there was some sort of different negotiation happening at a complete different level within the system. Yet, that was really considered a specific point in the context of analyzing relevance of women agency in the historical normative legal reform. In the second case, or the second example, the study reflects actually on some sort of discussions also within the interviews. And that's really with regard to the fact that normative development remain ongoing under the conflict. And for them, that's very remarkable. I mean, there were discussions about honor killing, for example, since ever, and these discussions and this specific matter was always an essential matter in the context of seeking justice for women femicide, and honor killing has been an issue in the area and different sort of cultural context for many sort of periods of times. However, the fact that it did really take some sort of changes after 2011 was quite remarkable. There were amendments before, that's really based on the law that was produced also based on French laws with crimes related to crimes of passion. And there were laws, actually attempts to make amendments in each of 2009 and 2011, which really replaced the mitigating excuses with a specific sort of punishment. It was ranging between 2 years and more, minimum of 2 years in 2009 and 7 years in 2011, until it was completely abolished in 2020. In this context, however, it's remarkable that the autonomous administration of North and East Syria did really produce progressive also law with regard to the honor and femicide crimes in 2014. And I think this dynamic was also quite conducive in the discussions and in the way these changes brought also in the Syrian law. this is so, since it does really raise a question towards why it's not really possible to take such a step, especially that a few other countries in the area did already take such a step, and the rise in the number of honor killing was really always on a high after the war. So there was particularly need to take such a step, and I think 2020 was not particularly an early date for such a reality. So in that context, this example is really brought by within the interviews, based on the fact that the women did not really feel that was particularly responsive in the right time. They did not really feel, yes, they take out, I mean, in the streets in a number of occasions, and some of the crimes were widespread on social media and so on, and that provoked a lot of reactions in the society. Beyond the internal sort of borders, and somehow did really take, the government somehow did really take an action eventually, but yet they would have thought that this should have been really a step that took place much earlier. This is one thing. And the other thing is that they believe that this is still really lacks a positive stand that criminalize this sort of action openly beyond the limits of the penal law. And how does it really describe it as purely as a murder? As I highlighted, the significance of these cases bring the cultural and the social dynamic within the country that has been characterized with this multiplicity and between the expected and non-expected. And they also call for the role of woman agency as a method of interpretation. So to what extent women feel actually, and of course they are not, for example, in the case of the law, abolishing of the law, there is absolutely no denial that this is a very essential sort of step. However, to what extent they see themselves part of all of this process, this is a complete different sort of dynamic, especially for empowerment from within. How do they really feel that it was responsive in that reality, and so on. I think after highlighting these two examples, it's very important to reflect also on more general reality and how the conflict did really alter the traditional sort of gender roles and enable women to overcome exclusionary practice and assume new roles as heads of the household and so on. However, it did not really offer that much of sustainability. And this is particularly so when we are dealing with issues with regard to current crisis, for example, like the earthquake, everything related to food securities and food chains in general, related to the open market and so on. And to what extent this is really making it hard to sustain such a change in the roles when everybody is under the tool of such tragedies. And I mean, the World Food Program in 2022 stated that Syria turned into one of the 6 countries with highest food insecurities in the world, and food prices are really increased by 532%. And that's really moving from a country that is self-sufficient in terms of food producing. An estimated 12.4 million people, about 60% of the population, suffer from food insecurity. I mean, in such a reality, how is it really possible to seek different sort of freedom or to consider actually alteration in roles, a pattern that could really produce a different sort of social dynamic? This is a very big question for women in general. As I really explained in the beginning, I think it's very important to take into account that while considering the realities of women in the country, this is something that can hardly depart from the fact that we are dealing with a multiplicity of crises that brought about years ago due to the regional reality, to security reality, something that we cannot also ignore, the environmental sort of aspect of it, the whole fact that even the start of the events in 2011 were also brought by some sort of droughts in the area. The fact that women and men in specific rural area did not take their own traditional roles to be able to participate in a system that they believe that could be really representative for them. That's very important to take into account. This persists in all senses, and while discussing women's rights, I think it's very important to understand that in order to be able to claim rights in such a domestic context that is really patched with war and all of other unfortunate crises, there is a need to understand that these rights do not exist within a vacuum. They do not really exist in a complete separation from a reality and a crisis that extends beyond the region. And that's important to bear in mind, especially when we seek also realization of rights in general. The aim, the purpose of adopting different sort of concept when we are talking about women agency is to emphasize the role of women and their ability in interpreting their own reality. I think this is very important, especially when compared with international understanding for all of these aspects, and how does it really reflect on the fact that economic sort of empowerment did not produce the empowerment or the liberation women aspired to in the area and in different other regions also. I think it's inevitable that in order to be able to realize rights, one of the main aspects that we could really look to is the urgent need to end the war and its ramifications. Of course, this is going to take years, and this is not something that seems to be very close in the future. However, without ending the war, and I mean, the hostilities might have really calmed down. However, ramifications of such a reality does really produce all of these discrepancies and all of these violations that are impossible to overcome in such a problematic reality. I think in the light of also the current catastrophe on the top, the disaster on the top of the disasters the country is suffering with, there is the risk of remaining stuck in the debate of security versus development. And this is coming from different aspects of security. I mean, while there is still sort of security related to freedoms and securities, human security and so on, and national security as it's been identified historically through the governmental official sort of narratives, there is also now the food security that is really taking over big regions around the world, if not all over the world. And that's really a big hindrance to the development and ability to seek any sort of materialized reform within the context of Syrian women journey, especially legal reforms. I think I'm gonna stop here, and we'll be happy actually to take further discussions.
Thank you so much, Dina. I know this has been a bit challenging without audience, and we will definitely try to. We will definitely be connecting with our audience, perhaps via tomorrow live. We will broadcast this live. I just wanted to ask you a question that I think people will be addressing, and that is, to what extent what can we look forward to in the context of post-war? What can we look forward to specifically, especially noting the recent calamity? How does war, and natural disaster combine to complicate the question of women empowerment and the question of women's rights and the law? And what can we? I know this is difficult to ask, but what can we look forward to?
I think it's very essential to highlight the issue of solidarity. I mean, since the failure of the aid system before the current crisis, it is very important to look into solidarity in general sense, the concept of international solidarity, and the understanding that this is really not within a context of donations as such. This is really an obligation, since the states are really all, we are all in that. This is something very difficult to escape. This is not something, and that's why I highlighted the issue of climate crisis and the current sort of natural disasters that could or could not really directly relate to this matter. However, the reality of the region, the reality of all of these aspects of food insecurities are not particularly only in Syria. They are in Syria and beyond. They are in the context of war and beyond, you see. And this is something that should be taken into account. What we are looking for, an understanding to the fact that this is raising responsibility. This is not an issue that does really stand completely out of obligations in general and our ability all to survive, because unless we really understand that all of these food chains are really planned in a specific way to produce somehow and not in specific areas, there is absolutely no hope in fighting against a reality that we don't comprehend and stand solid against.
Thanks, Dina. I am very happy that we were able to do this. I know that there are so many issues that can be developed from your talk to create research agendas, actually. And I really, really appreciate the work that you have put into this and your courage in dealing with the very many aspects of this topic. And in a place that is sometimes quite difficult to get to, even for Syrians themselves. I would like to thank you so much for joining us today, and I apologize again on behalf of the location you're calling from for them not allowing for a live broadcast in this particular case, and I hope that we are able to host you again and kind of try to make up for this sometime in the future here at George Mason, if that is possible.
Hopefully. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dina, and hope to speak with you soon.
Thank you.
Take care.